Welcome back to NDC News, and it has been a minute for those of you returning to my channel. And just a little note that in the future, I will be gearing my content on here more towards social commentary. So if you see my last video and or my video on race swapping, those will give you an idea of what you can expect. And if you haven't, please make sure to check them out because I personally think they're some of my better videos. And before we begin, of course, spoiler warnings if you haven't already seen The Batman, which I do 100% recommend. So, towards the final acts of this lovely 2-hour and 47-minute long movie, we find out that this Riddler's villain origin story comes from the unfulfilled promises of Thomas Wayne's Urban Renewal Project Fund, which, upon his death, gets divided up amongst Gotham's crime bosses rather than being used for its original purpose of bettering Gotham's rundown institutions, such as the very orphanage that the Riddler grew up in. And so the Riddler in present day decides to go on a truth campaign of sorts in order to reveal how the different power players in even the government of Gotham carved up the fund and used this money for their own corruption, all the while lying to the public and saying that the Urban Renewal Project had been this big success. And in many ways, this idea of government corruption poisoning the promises of urban renewal, leaving those who needed this support the most even more vulnerable, is not something Matt Reeves, the director, pulled out of thin air. But this is actually based on the real-life failures of urban renewal projects that were taking place throughout the United States, starting in the 1930s all the way until the 1960s. And just like in Gotham, the way these projects were being marketed to the public was much different than how they were playing out in actuality. While these projects were being branded as being for the betterment of America's urban centers, the results of these federally sponsored programs often left thousands of low-income and largely black families displaced and without anywhere to live. There's one House of Representatives report that estimated that about 66,000 families were displaced during the peak of these so-called urban renewal projects. And in the wake of this displacement, thousands of low-income families were forced into the slums where they experienced the exact same kinds of deplorable conditions that the Riddler described in Arkham Asylum, with many of the things that he mentioned being based off of real-life cases. And I think the decision to have Riddler's driving force be based on a real-life social issue is a reflection of what seems like the beginnings of a new trend taking place in the superhero genre. Just a couple years back, HBO's Watchmen took a very similar approach by having the 1920s Tulsa race riot be a part of the main character's origin story, which really sparked a national conversation over what was a generally overlooked American tragedy.
And this is something that is really important and much needed in the superhero genre, because at its core, the philosophy of superheroes is that there are these characters, these people who have special powers and abilities that embolden them to be able to tackle the threats that us normal people never could. And by having these characters use their popularity to raise an awareness to real-world issues and promote change, they're being even truer to the core philosophy that makes them heroes in the first place. So folks, that is all I have for today's video, and if you enjoyed the approach that I took here, I do recommend that you subscribe to my channel, as my next video will be Scarlet Witch and the villainization of femininity, which is going to be a commentary on all the online discourse that's being had surrounding whether or not Scarlet Witch should be classified as a villain. So until then.